Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
This time we're heading to Pittsburgh, California.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, it's late 1998, early 1999, and we're going to be looking at, well, basically a Wikipedia article. It's about the Pittsburgh Serial Murders,
Okay.
which is a case that to this day remains unsolved, despite FBI involvement and a governor's reward. 5 victims were found dead
Oh my God.
under very suspicious circumstances. And so the question becomes, was it one killer or were there multiple people involved?
Right.
So we're going to kind of put on our detective hats and see if we can connect the dots.
Okay.
One of the things that's so fascinating about this is that, a lot of times when we think about serial killer cases, we think about sort of like a similar victim,
Mm-hmm.
But this one is really interesting in that there's a real mix.
Real mix, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's start with Michael Tan. He was 27 years old. He was found beaten and drowned in a ditch, and his apartment was ransacked. So initially, investigators were thinking robbery gone wrong.
Makes sense, yeah.
But he's the only male victim,
Mm.
which, makes you wonder, is he connected or is he just in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Right.
Then there's Lisa Diane Norrell. She was only 15 years old.
Oh, wow.
She disappeared after a quinceañera rehearsal.
Oh, gosh.
Her body was later found. She'd been strangled. And her case is actually the one that led to the governor offering a reward.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's so tragic, too. And then, on top of that, there's the fact that 2 men were initially arrested for Lisa's murder.
Yeah.
But were later cleared.
Yeah.
Just imagine for her family to have to go through that. Not only the loss, but the false hope. And then, kind of like a renewed grief with each twist and turn in the investigation.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. Then there's Jessica L. Frederick.
Uh-huh.
She was 27. She was involved in prostitution.
Uh-huh.
And she was stabbed to death. They found her in an auto wrecking yard.
Oh, wow.
And even her boyfriend was initially suspected
Right.
because they found bloodstains in his apartment.
Right.
And this is where, kind of the forensic science at the time comes in. DNA testing was relatively new.
Yeah.
It was becoming more and more common, but it was just advanced enough to clear Jessica's boyfriend.
Right.
Imagine if this had happened even a few years earlier.
Yeah.
The case might have gone down a totally different path.
Absolutely.
Okay, then there's Rachel Cruz. She was 32. Like Jessica, she was struggling with drug addiction and involved in prostitution. And she was found strangled just like Lisa.
Okay.
And here's where it gets really kind of chilling. There was another prostitute who was attacked around that time,
Oh, wow.
but survived.
Yeah.
And she described her attacker as a Hispanic male driving a dark Chevrolet Monte Carlo.
Hmm.
And that's the only potential suspect description we have in any of these cases.
Interesting.
Yeah. So already we're seeing, some potential patterns.
Right.
But also some, distinct differences.
Right.
Then finally we have Valerie Dawn. They called her China Schultz. She was 27.
Okay.
And she had moved away from Pittsburgh, but returned shortly before she was murdered.
Oh, okay.
And just like Michael and Rachel, her body was also found in a ditch.
Oh, wow.
But there's another twist. There was a witness who saw her getting into a faded brown 4-door sedan,
Okay.
driven by, get this, a large, older man, described as either Hispanic or Samoan.
Okay, so could this be our mystery driver?
Right. And why were so many of the victims found in ditches? Was it a way to conceal the bodies quickly, or did it indicate something about the killer's familiarity with those specific locations?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, before we dive into the suspects,
Yeah.
what do you make of the victim profiles? Is there anything that stands out to you?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a mix, right? You've got these potential patterns. You've got seemingly random elements. So you've got 3 of the victims that were involved in drugs and prostitution.
Yeah.
And then Lisa and Michael seem totally unconnected to that world.
Right.
And then there's that whole thing with the ditches, 3 of the victims were found in ditches. It's not something you typically see with serial killers.
Yeah.
They often have more elaborate disposal methods or they, try to display their victims.
Yeah.
This makes me wonder, was this more of a crime of opportunity?
Yeah.
Or like a panicked attempt to hide the evidence quickly?
That's a really good point. It's like, I don't know, they were trying to be discreet,
Yeah.
but also had a preferred disposal method for some reason.
Yeah.
It's so strange.
Yeah, it really does make you think, like, was there something about those ditches
Right.
that drew the killer there,
Yeah.
Were they just convenient or did they mean something to him?
It's a chilling thought.
It's...
So we have these 5 victims, their lives tragically cut short.
Yeah.
Did the police ever find any suspects?
Well, there were a few arrests, but they all kind of led to dead ends. Gary Lee Walton and David Michael Henneby,
Okay.
they were initially arrested for Lisa Norell's murder, but later cleared.
Right.
Mohammed Ismail Niaz, Jessica Frederick's boyfriend,
Uh-huh.
he was also arrested, but DNA evidence proved he was innocent.
So back to the forensics. This case took place at a pretty pivotal time for DNA technology.
Right.
I mean, it was evolving rapidly, but not as sophisticated as it is today.
Yeah.
Could that have hindered the investigation, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, back then, DNA analysis wasn't nearly as advanced as it is now.
Right.
Imagine trying to solve this puzzle with only half the pieces.
Yeah.
Investigators could use DNA to exclude suspects, but building a case based on a match was much more difficult.
Yeah.
Today, with expanded databases and more sensitive techniques, they might be able to get new leads from the evidence they collected back then.
So there's a chance that with today's technology, some of those old samples could reveal new information.
Exactly.
It's kind of hopeful, right? It's like those cold cases you see on TV where a familial DNA match just cracks the case wide open decades later.
Exactly, and it's not just DNA. Other forensic techniques have advanced significantly, too.
Right.
Analyzing trace evidence like fibers or microscopic particles could reveal previously overlooked connections.
Okay, so there's the forensic angle. What about the suspects themselves? Was there anyone who seemed promising, but the evidence just wasn't there yet?
Well, one of the names that came up was Philip Garrido.
Wait, Phil Carrito, the kidnapper of J.C. Dugard?
That's right. He was actually working near where some of the bodies were found during the time of the murders.
I remember hearing about that connection. It seemed like a really solid lead, but a search of his property didn't turn up anything, right?
Correct. Despite Garrido's history of crimes against young girls and his proximity to the crime scenes, no evidence was ever found linking him to the Pittsburgh case.
That's frustrating. You think they might revisit that connection now with new forensic tools? Just in case they missed something.
It's certainly possible, and his case brings up another point. What if the Pittsburgh killer was never caught for any other crimes?
Right.
Their DNA might not even be in the system.
That's a scary thought. So we could be dealing with someone who committed these murders and then just stopped,
It's possible.
vanished.
It's a real possibility. Or what if the killer is already deceased?
Oh.
That would make things more difficult, but not impossible.
Yeah.
Investigators could potentially use genealogical DNA testing to track down relatives and see if any familial matches emerge.
Okay, so we're dealing with a lot of what-ifs here.
Hmm.
But even if we can't get a DNA match, could there be other ways to make progress on this case? What about those witness statements we talked about earlier?
Yeah, those witnesses could be key. Especially the one who saw Valerie Schultz getting into that car.
Right.
I mean, it's been years, but you never know. Memories can be triggered by the strangest things.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a detail they remember now that didn't seem important back then.
Right. What if they just didn't think it was important at the time?
Exactly. Even a tiny detail could be the missing piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And, with time, witnesses might be more willing to come forward with information they were hesitant to share before.
Oh, that's true.
Maybe they were afraid of the perpetrator or just didn't fully grasp the significance of what they saw.
It's like those moments in crime dramas where a witness suddenly remembers a crucial detail after years of silence.
Right. Exactly.
What if they just revisited those witness statements and asked some new questions?
It's definitely worth a shot. And it's not just about witnesses either.
What do you mean?
Re-examining the physical evidence with fresh eyes, using new techniques,
Right.
that could also be really revealing. What might have been inconclusive years ago could yield new insights now.
So it's about combining old information with new technology and a fresh perspective. But let's step back for a second. We've talked about potential connections between the victims, but what about the bigger picture? What was Pittsburgh like back then?
Good point. Context is everything.
Right.
Pittsburgh in the late 90s was dealing with high crime rates, gang activity, a drug problem.
Okay.
These factors could have created an environment where a predator could easily operate and maybe even go unnoticed.
So the killer could have been someone who just blended in with all that.
Absolutely. Making it even harder for investigators to separate them from the noise.
Right, and maybe people were hesitant to talk to the police because of fear or distrust?
Exactly. Fear is a powerful silencer. And in a community struggling with these issues, trust in law enforcement might have been fragile.
Yeah.
That could explain why some people might have held back even if they had something important to share.
It's tragic to think that the same things that might have made Pittsburgh vulnerable to a serial killer could have also hindered the investigation.
Yeah, it's like a vicious cycle.
It is. But even if the case remains unsolved, are there any lessons we can learn from the Pittsburgh murders? Anything that could help prevent similar tragedies in the future?
Definitely. One key takeaway is the importance of community engagement and building trust between law enforcement and the people they serve.
Right.
If people feel safe coming forward with information, it can make a huge difference.
Especially with complex cases like this one.
Absolutely. And it also highlights the need for robust support systems for vulnerable populations.
Like, who are you thinking of?
People struggling with addiction, those involved in sex work.
Okay.
If they feel safe seeking help without fear of judgment or repercussions, it could prevent them from becoming targets.
It's about creating a safety net for those who are most at risk.
Exactly, and empowering them to speak up if they sense danger.
Right. So what's the takeaway for our listeners who are now completely hooked on this case?
Stay curious, keep digging. There's a ton of information available online forums, websites dedicated to cold cases.
Yeah, I've seen those.
You can connect with other armchair detectives, share theories, maybe uncover a piece of the puzzle that investigators have missed.
It's like crowdsourcing for justice, right?
Precisely. And if you have any information that could be relevant, no matter how small,
Okay.
please contact the authorities. Your tip could be the one that breaks this case wide open.
Well said. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. This case, with all its twists and turns and lingering questions, is a reminder that the search for truth can be long and complex.
It is.
But it's a journey worth taking, not just for the victims and their families, but for all of us. Because in the end, justice is about more than just catching the perpetrator. It's about restoring a sense of order, healing old wounds, and ensuring that the memory of those we've lost is never forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.